Welcome to Judgment Decision Making. I'm Dr. Padilla. Today we're going to talk about improving school choice. 1944, President Roosevelt included the right to a good education in what he called the Second Bill of Rights. This created this concept of school choice. Milton Friedman suggested that the best way to improve children's school is to introduce competition. If schools compete, kids win, and if schools compete, those who are least advantaged have the most to gain. It's the general theory that competition helps lower performing schools become better because they need to catch up to the higher performing schools. You see this theory in all aspects of government life, where the suggestion is if you introduce competition, everyone wins. And that's the foundation of the concept behind school choice. Now, is that actually true? We're going to talk about today how by simply introducing competition, does that actually improve students' outcomes? Or do you need to do more to help people make better choices with the competition that's available? Okay, I'm going to start with this video that lays out some of the arguments and pros and cons for different types of schools.
And first, let me acknowledge this is a controversial area. Charter proponents will point to positive news stories like this one about the KIPP Charter Schools Network.
Most KIPP students are chosen by lottery, regardless of prior academic record. Almost all meet federal poverty guidelines. And yet 82% go on to college.
I think one thing that I learned at KIPP really well is that a lot of your effort doesn't reap any success until way later in the future.
Now, honestly, any philosophy that can get those kind of results might be worth considering. In the same way that if we found out they boosted our immunity, we'd seriously consider eating koalas. But critics argue charters overstate their successes, siphon off talented students, and divert precious resources within a school district. Now, for this piece, and I know this is going to make some people on both sides very angry, we're going to set aside whether or not charter schools are a good idea in principle, because whether they are or not, in 42 states and DC, we're doing them. So instead, we're going to look at how they operate in practice. One group found, on average, charters had a slight edge over traditional public schools in reading and did about the same in math, but acknowledged charter quality is uneven across the states and across schools. And that is putting it mildly, because around the country, there have been charter schools so flawed, they don't make it through the school year.
This charter school suddenly closed its doors in the middle of the day.
An Orange County charter school suddenly closed its doors without notice.
The local charter school is suddenly and unexpectedly closing its doors.
On our dining room table, my son left these two notes to us. One says, "Dear Mom, is the school going out of business?"
Yes, you are right. That kid spelled business, biznos, which I'd argue is a much better way to spell it.
The first is that school vouchers allow parents the right to choose. As we've learned throughout this course, choice is very important, but structuring choice is also important. So it's a good idea to give people the capacity to choose, to give them the freedom to choose, but they actually have to have that freedom. School vouchers allow low-income students the right to a better education. This is, a very important pro, and it suggests that lower income students just wouldn't have access to higher quality education without these voucher programs, and that is true. Third is that voucher programs lead to better public schools overall. This is what I talked about before, the idea of competition. Competition, in theory, should help the lower performing schools by forcing them to perform more in line with the higher performing schools. Okay, how about the cons? Some of the cons suggest that school vouchers violate the separation of church and state. 80% of the charter schools out there are actually affiliated with religious institutions. So providing these religious institutions federal funding to educate students, some people argue is a violation of church and state. The next is that voucher programs just don't work. There is some evidence that these voucher programs have small improvements in students' outcomes, but they're highly variable, and that is certainly not consistent across all of the country. And finally, voucher programs actively harm failing public school system. And I think this is an important one that people really focus on is that when you remove the money that the public schools would get for one student and give it to a charter school, you are crippling the ability of the public school to perform better. You're removing money that they would use to pay their teachers and to increase facilities and so on. So rather than forcing those failing public schools to improve their education, you're crippling their ability to do so. Now, I'm going to remain agnostic on the what side of the fence I'm on, but I just wanted you to understand how people think about the debate between this school choice or no school choice. And what we've seen from this class, and particularly this book, is that the just maximize choice mantra does not always lead to the best possible outcomes. So we need to ask, when it comes to schools, do more choices actually help? Now, before we move on, I just want to take a moment and I'd like to ask you, what issues can you think of that might come from school choice based on what we've learned in the class? I want you to pause this video and think for yourself what possible issues might come by giving people lots of choice and lots of information about what schools to send their children to. Okay, hopefully you've thought of some. The one I'll point out is that while on average voucher and charter schools might have slight, possibly non-significant improvements, they are highly variable throughout the system, and parents are not equipped to make effective decisions with this complex information. Like we've said throughout this book, when you're providing people with very complex information and a big important decision that they're going to make likely once in their lifetime and not get much feedback on, you have to structure that decision to help them make their best possible choice. Otherwise, they're probably going to make a poor choice given the complexity of the scenario. This is a great example. So in Worcester, Massachusetts, 4,700 students, roughly 1/5 of students were eligible to transfer when they enacted these programs. 800 students also had the right to collect federal money for supplemental educational services. After 6 months of the program, they found that only 1 student had actually switched schools and 2 had taken advantage of the supplemental services. And all of these students were in low-performing schools. So they had the option to switch to a better school, but instead they stayed in the status quo. They remained in the school that they were in, and only 1 student switched. The issue here is this concept of friendly discouragement. The Worcester schools discouraged changing. What they would do is they'd highlight the issues with No Child Left Behind. They talk about all the things they're doing to improve their school system. Of course, they don't want students to switch from the public school to a charter school. So they were trying to emphasize all the great things they're doing in their school. Additionally, and this is probably the more important one, is that they required a multi-step process to switch schools, which included meeting multiple times, going to see different schools. There's all of this elaborate bureaucracy around switching schools. And they restricted information about other schools, so they didn't make it easy for parents to compare between schools. Now, with that information, it is reasonable that parents wouldn't switch because it was hard to do so, and they didn't know which program to switch into. Now, I want to talk about a couple additional examples of similar types of these nudging discouragements. One is with voter suppression. So in voter suppression, the general concept is that you just add some additional steps to make it harder for some people to register to vote. And while that might not seem like a big issue, what we've learned in this book is every time you add complexity to the system, people just start dropping off and are less likely to engage in an action that would actually help them. Similarly, this is one of the theories behind why people are making it difficult for individuals to get abortion access. So there's a variety of laws that are being instituted for just adding some additional steps to the abortion process, which include a certain wait time and reading some information and meeting with a counselor. Now, regardless of what you think about the topic, it is true that when you add the more complexity to a system, less people are likely to engage in those actions. So this is absolutely a discouraging nudge that is significantly reducing the amount of abortions out there. And the last one I'll talk about is this really interesting one from Utah, which is actually where I used to live, where they have all of these complicated alcohol laws that make it harder to get alcohol. And the one I'll point out that I find the most fascinating is in restaurants that have an alcohol license, if they serve food for families, they can't display their alcohol in front of the public. It has to be behind some glass. So even just making it trickier to know which alcohol that they have available is a slight discouragement from drinking alcohol. When parents pick schools, status quo bias plays a huge role. They're likely to just remain in their neighborhood school because they know that school even if it's underperforming. A nudge that's fairly effective has to do with recap. So what they did in an experiment is a sample of parents were given a fact sheet about schools, much in the spirit of the recap idea. And the experiment found that parents who received the fact sheet, even low-income parents, made better choices. And that's fantastic. It means that people would actually want to send their children to better schools. Of course they would. But they didn't have the information to do so. So simply by providing them the information in an easy to understand format, you can really improve people's judgments. This is another interesting example where high school students were nudged to getting into college. So in San Marcos, Texas, the school superintendent and administrators at nearby community college were looking for ways to get more of the largely Latino population into college. They hit on an effective nudge that produced big results in the end. And what the nudge was in order to graduate from high school, students would have to complete an application to the nearby community college. Now, there were some other things that they did in terms of providing some additional counseling, some financial aid, and that sort of thing. But this was the big nudge. In order to graduate, you had to apply to the local community college. And that one change increased the students that were accepted into college from 11% to 45%, which is massive, suggesting that students did want to go to college, they knew the importance of it, but they just needed a nudge to help them to do what they actually wanted to do. Okay, summary here. What is true for investments in prescription drugs is true for education as well. It is not enough to make lots of choices available and then hope parents choose wisely. School systems need to put parents in a position to think through their choices and to exercise their freedom rather than to rely on the default option. If you provide people with a bunch of options but don't give them the ability to evaluate those options, you might as well not have given them the options anyway. Finally, both parents and children need the right incentives. And this one is a little bit tricky because why should we incentivize people to do something that's good for them? That should be enough. But you and I both know that it can be pretty hard to make changes and do things that are complicated, like a multi-step process for getting your kid into another school. And with just a little bit of incentivization, that could be the nudge you need to start the process, even if it's something you already want to do.